Welcome to the Museum of Northern Arizona. I'm Alan Petersen, and I'm going to give you a kind of a mini behind-the-scenes tour of our fine art collection here today, focused on paintings of the Grand Canyon. I'm in the Catherine Bartlett reading room at the library at the museum, named for Catherine Bartlett, one of our original founding staff members. And I got about a dozen paintings I'm going to share with you this afternoon, which is only a small selection of what we have, but I tried to pick some of our real treasures and some things that you might not have seen before, and some old favorites that you might recognize. So the Grand Canyon is a lot of people's favorite landscape and favorite landscape destination. And 150 years ago, people would not have thought of traveling to the Grand Canyon. Well, people didn't travel to the Grand Canyon very much 150 years ago. But it just wouldn't have met their criteria for an attractive landscape, as funny as that might sound to us today. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But before the first tourists began arriving at the Grand Canyon in the 1880s, in the east, in the Hudson River Valley and the Catskill and Adirondack Mountains of New York, the Hudson River School painters, artists like Thomas Cole and Asher B. Durand, as a couple of examples, had really almost literally trained American audiences to appreciate landscape as not just an aesthetic enjoyment, but also landscape as a destination for indulging in that aesthetic enjoyment. And their paintings reproduced on steamship timetables and advertising posters, calendars, that sort of thing, really initiated, really kind of kicked off the American interest in what we'd call today landscape tourism. Drawing people initially up the Hudson River into the Catskills and around Adirondacks, but then, of course, leading to other attractive landscapes. And as I mentioned, we'll come back to that a little bit later in a very 19th century kind of way. So I'm really excited to do this talk because I love our collection. And one of the reasons I love it is because we do have a particularly strong set of late 19th century, early 20th century paintings of the Grand Canyon, including what could be the very first oil painting done of the Grand Canyon. And that's this painting behind me right here, done by Samuel Coleman. Samuel Coleman was a New York artist, and he was associated with what's sometimes referred to as the second generation of the Hudson River School. And in I have to look at my notes, in 1870, Coleman made his first of several trips out west. He took the Union Pacific Railroad to Wyoming, and he got off the train in Green River, the same location, it's worth pointing out, where John Wesley Powell launched his two river explorations, which we'll also come back to a little bit later. Anyway, Coleman got off the train, and he basically did a big circuit throughout the West, both by stagecoach and by horseback, from Green River, Wyoming, where he did several watercolor paintings. He traveled to California and ultimately to Yosemite, which was kind of his western destination. And he did some painting in Yosemite and turned around and headed home. And it was on his way home in Peach Springs that he did the sketches and perhaps some watercolor color studies for this painting titled Distant View of the Colorado Canyon from Peach Springs. And he returned home to New York City and did a number of paintings from that one journey, including this one. The painting's not dated, unfortunately, but it was probably done in 1871, possibly 72. And it has this kind of characteristic sort of silvery patina, silvery light or platinum kind of light that characterized his paintings in many cases. He's best known for his paintings of the Hudson River and the Hudson River Valley north of New York City, like around around Kingston and up towards Storm King and in that area. And his subject was the river and the valley and the boats on the river. Anyway, so Coleman did this painting in, like I said, 1871 or 72. And there's another very similar one that he did, and that painting is also not dated. So we know of at least two paintings of this basic subject, both about the same size, same kind of coloration. And the great thing about this painting, aside from this, I find it fascinating that Coleman chose to come through this pretty remote part of northern Arizona on his way home to New York. But it's interesting to note that if he did do this painting in 1871, it predates Thomas Moran's grandiose painting, Chasm of the Colorado, done in 1873-74. And Coleman's visit to the canyon predates Thomas Moran's by 3 years. And so that's why I say that this could very well be the first or the first of two oil paintings by a professional artist of the Grand Canyon. And one of the true treasures in our collection that I'll show you today. Okay, so I'm going to move this out of the way. And yes, the frame is very heavy. And we're going to take a look at a painting, a watercolor painting by William Henry Holmes. William Henry Holmes was truly kind of a Renaissance man. He began his career as an artist. He learned geology in the field with Ferdinand Hayden and the geologists who worked for Hayden on Hayden's geographical and geological survey of the Rocky Mountains. Oh, yeah, it is kind of drooping right there. So Holmes learned geology in the field with the professional geologists employed by Hayden. And so after 2 years, 2 field seasons working with Hayden, Holmes was promoted to being a geologist. And this is back when you could still do that sort of thing. So his duties included not only studying geological structures in the Rocky Mountain region, but then also doing topographical drawings that would be used by the topographers and the geologists and geographers. So this painting came about in a very fortuitous way. And this is one of our true treasures in our collection. It's a watercolor on paperboard. And in 1875, John Wesley Powell, let me back up just a half a step. John Wesley Powell had done his 2 river explorations in 1869 and 71-72, and in 1871 began a 10-year survey of the Grand Canyon region based out of Kanab. By 1875, Powell was spending more and more time in Washington, D.C., and he hired Clarence Dutton, another Army officer and brilliant geologist, to come and run the field operations of the Powell survey in the Grand Canyon region. So Dutton's work took him to southern Utah, to Bryce and Zion, and studying what he referred to as the Grand Staircase running south, the series of plateaus that run south from southern Utah. And by 1880, he was ready to conclude his field work. And he was thinking about publishing the final report. And in preparation for that, he invited William Henry Holmes to come out to the Grand Canyon to do some drawings that would become illustrations for that report. And that report is the very highly regarded, very beautiful Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District, published in 1882. So in August of 1880, Holmes came out to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, met up with Dutton and the team, and he spent about 6 weeks drawing along the north rim. He started as far east as what's now referred to as Marble Viewpoint, and did a drawing at a location called Dog Point, which is also near Dog Lake. And he worked his way to the west, and he stopped at Cape Final. He did some drawings near the North Rim Lodge, and out near Powell Plateau, and much further west out in the Toroweap area in the Uinkaret Plateau. And he did a number of drawings. He did about, I think about 30 drawings. And I want to come over here and show you this drawing. This is a reproduction of one of Holmes' original drawings. And this is published, this is a print that was published as part of the atlas that was included with the tertiary history. And this print is 1/3 of a panorama from Point Sublime, and this is the view to the east. And if you're familiar with the Grand Canyon, you can see this is Shiva Temple, and here's Isis Temple, and Osiris, and Confucius and Mencius temples. And you can also see the artist hard at work with, presumably, Clarence Dutton leaning over his shoulder, saying something like, "By Jove, William, you've got it." But he also might be saying something like, maybe the red wall needs to be a little bit taller over in that section there, Bill. At any rate, I show this because the tertiary history is considered to be the most beautiful of the reports published by the Great Western Surveys. It also illustrates Holmes' innate style as a geological illustrator. You can see it's very linear, it's very crystal clear, and in most respects, more clear than photographs that were being made at this time. So this is kind of like what we tend to think of when we think of William Henry Holmes. And again, Dutton realized that scenes like this were not going to be appreciated by Eastern audiences. He knew the audience very well. That audience had been trained, as I mentioned earlier, by Hudson River School artists who were depicting scenes, of verdant, lush Eastern landscapes covered with trees and grass. And I'm going to read a paragraph from the tertiary history that illustrates Dutton's point. And this is from chapter 8, which is titled "The Panorama from Point Sublime," which these 3 panoramic drawings are meant to be illustrations for. Dutton wrote, "The Grand Canyon of the Colorado is a great innovation in modern ideas of scenery and in our conceptions of the grandeur, beauty, and power of nature. As with all great innovations, it is not to be comprehended in a day or a week or even in a month. It must be dwelt upon and studied, and the study must comprise the slow acquisition of the meaning and spirit of that marvelous scenery which characterizes the plateau country, and of which the Great Chasm is the superlative manifestation. The study and slow mastery of the influences of that class of scenery and its full appreciation is a special culture, requiring time, patience, and long familiarity for its consummation." Let me just pause and say, so who would have met Dutton's criteria at that point? Well, probably really only the 20 or 30 men who had worked with the Powell survey over the last 10 years. He goes on, "The lover of nature whose perceptions have been trained in the Alps, in Italy, Germany, or New England, in the Appalachians or Cordilleras, in Scotland or Colorado, would enter this strange region with a shock and dwell there for a time with a sense of oppression and perhaps horror. Whatsoever things he had learned to regard as beautiful and noble, he would seldom or never see, and whatsoever he might see would appear to him as anything but beautiful and noble. Whatsoever might be bold and striking would at first seem only grotesque. The colors would be the very ones he had learned to shun as tawdry and bizarre. The tones and shades, modest and tender, subdued and yet rich, in which his fancy had always taken a special delight, would be the ones which are conspicuously absent. But time would bring a gradual change." So Dutton knew that his audience were by that time lovers of the eastern seashore, of the eastern mountains, of the eastern rivers. And the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau have nothing in common with those landscapes. And in fact, one of the beauties of the Colorado Plateau and the Grand Canyon is that the landscape is stripped bare of all that vegetation, so we can see the geology and appreciate the architectural forms that you can see in this drawing. So on to the watercolor. This watercolor is called In the Canyon. It was painted in 1880. And you can see immediately how entirely different it is from the drawing. It's expressive, it's very rich in terms of color. Now, of course, the print was not meant to be colorful. It was meant to be, an illustration of geological structures. But you can see that even in the painting, which is very abstract and very loosely painted, especially relative to the drawing you were just looking at, you can see that there's small, subtle inflections and nuances in the paint that help to suggest some of that geological nature. So on the one hand, it's highly abstract, especially for 1880, if you think about it. On the other hand, it's expressive. It's an emotional response to the canyon where Holmes had spent 6 weeks. And at the same time, just because of his artistic ability, consciously or subconsciously, it's hard to know, he's still able to get in the little indications of what constitutes the geological nature of the subject. I always love seeing this painting. Okay, so let's go on. I'm going to move this out of the way. And this is a small oil painting by Louis Aiken. No relationship to our present-day Bruce Aiken. Louis was originally from Portland, Oregon. Bless Portland, Oregon. And he moved to New York City, where he worked as an illustrator and professional artist. And in 1903, he got I want to say he got a call. He was called upon by the Santa Fe Railroad Company, who commissioned him to do some paintings of the Hopi villages and Hopi villagers that they could use for promotional purposes. And this was at the beginning of the Santa Fe Railroad's major campaign to hire well-known artists to bring them out west, where they would do paintings, and the Santa Fe would, in exchange for room and board and the train travel, would take 1 or 2 paintings from the artist that they would use for everything from the covers of train timetables or posters, travel posters, or calendars. And at one point, the Santa Fe collection of art included more than 3,000 works of art. And Louis Aiken did a number of works that were used by the Santa Fe Railroad. So Louis came out to the Hopi villages in 1903, and he fell in love with the location, and he fell in love with the people, and he wound up living there for about 4 years. And he made some very close friends there, and he was inducted into at least one of the clans. So Louis went back to New York in 1906, I think it was, for a visit. And at a party of artist friends, he floated an idea that he'd been pondering. And he had been pondering the idea of establishing an artist colony in one of the Hopi villages, which in retrospect sounds a little silly. But at this time, there were a number of very prominent, well-known, and very productive artist colonies in the United States. One near St. Augustine, Florida, another in Carmel in California. And there was a big colony in Maine also. So Louis was, he was a guy of the times, and he thought this would be a great idea because the people were friendly. It was a striking location, very remote, so artists could focus on their work. And only one fellow artist took him up on his offer, and that was Kate Corey. And Kate Corey, who was also working as a commercial artist and a fine artist and illustrator in New York, came out to the Hopi villages in 1907 at Lewis's invitation. And son of a gun, if when she arrived, she didn't see that Lewis had already left. He had moved to Flagstaff. I guess he had had enough. Anyway, so Kate Corey arrives up at Hopi, and she, at first she kind of wonders what on earth she got herself into, but she too loved the people. They loved her. She settled into living there for several years herself, produced many paintings, and produced over 2,000 photographs of Hopi villagers and the landscape. And we have those negatives here at the Museum of Northern Arizona in our archives. And one reason why I want to tell this story is because in our current exhibit, Liberating Landscape, we have some of Kate's prints from her negatives, and we have a couple of her paintings done during her time up at Hopi. So what did Lewis do when he left Hopi? Well, he moved to Flagstaff, and he at one point lived in a barn about a quarter of a mile east of us here, that's now referred to as the Aiken barn. And the last few, at least the last 2 or 3 museum directors have lived in that barn, which has been very nicely renovated. And Lewis focused his attentions on the Grand Canyon and scenes around Flagstaff. We also have a painting of the peaks that he did. And this is a very typical Grand Canyon painting of Lewis's. It's called Morning Hermit Canyon. And it's a view from, I'm not sure exactly where it is, but I want to say Yuma Point, which is down in the canyon on the west side of Hermit Canyon. And if you've hiked the Hermit Trail, this is, I can't remember this butte, the name of this butte, but the Hermit Trail switchbacks up this steep slope, which in the middle of the day is just like a broiler. And then it hooks around here and then goes up the cathedral stairs. Unlike most of his contemporaries of the time, an exception who we'll meet in a few, Lewis did a number of paintings down in the inner canyons and along the river. We have another beautiful painting in the collection called Christmas Day, which is a view from the bottom of the Bright Angel Trail looking up towards Brahma and Zoroaster temples. But I picked this painting because it's very typical of Lewis's work. It's very rich coloristically, and he has a really great effective depiction of the landscape space. And you can see how the colors kind of become more subdued as you go back in the distance in this. From the barn, which sadly burned down and was rebuilt, Lewis moved downtown where he had a studio on the second floor of the Babbitt building at the corner of Aspen and San Francisco. And you may know that Bruce Aiken today has his studio on the second floor of the Babbitt building, and we like to consider that it's possible that Bruce's studio was at one time Lewis's studio. Lewis regrettably died at a very young age. I think he was about 40, maybe not quite 40. And he died of pneumonia in the original Flagstaff Hospital in 1913. So I'm going to move this painting, and I'm going to bring it over here. I'll bring this over here. So the next painting we're going to take a look at is by James or Jimmy Swinnerton, and this is called Vegetable House. And I've always loved this painting. I've loved it for a number of reasons. First of all, Jimmy Swinnerton was an amazing artist, and we have a number of his works in our collection. But I love it because the ostensible subject is not the Grand Canyon, it's the root cellar. And you might be asking yourself, what on earth is there a root cellar doing on the south rim of the Grand Canyon? So this is from the south rim. It's looking north, and there really aren't any clearly identifiable landmarks aside from this is Cape Royal over here, and then looking east towards the Palisades of the Desert, which are very generalized in this painting. So why did Jimmy Swinnerton do a painting of a root cellar? And it probably wasn't the only one, because there would have been a root cellar. Well, actually, they probably had refrigeration at the El Tovar Hotel. Well, William Randolph Hearst, the great publishing magnate, owned some property and had a small house out near Grandview Point. And this is the root cellar for Mr. Hearst's house, which I don't believe he ever actually visited. When Hearst visited the Grand Canyon, he most usually stayed in his Pullman car in the siding by the El Tovar Hotel, by the train station there. Swinnerton was an illustrator and a cartoonist for Hearst Publications. He began his career in San Francisco, excuse me, and moved to New York for a time. And I don't know that he was friends with William Randolph Hearst. I don't know that William Randolph Hearst had friends, but Hearst considered Swinnerton to be one of his finest employees, and he always gave him plum assignments when he could. So whether they were actually friends or not, it doesn't really matter, but they were professionally close at any rate. And Swinnerton first came to Arizona in 1906. He led a very kind of maybe perhaps typical life, as in his 20s he was quite a drinker and partier, and I don't know if I can throw carouser in there, but he led an enthusiastic life in his 20s, and it really took a physical toll on him, and he developed tuberculosis to boot. And a doctor said, you need to go to the desert and recuperate. And Swinnerton did. I think there are stories that the doctor thought that he didn't have a chance of survival. He was that ill. But Swinnerton came to Arizona in 1906, and he fell in love with the desert. He initially spent, I can't remember, maybe 6, 8, 9 months here, perhaps a year, before going back to the city and back to work full time. But he fell in love with the desert, and he had a remarkable recuperation and returned healthier than ever. Swinnerton's notable too because he did a kind of what today we might view as a not terribly politically correct cartoon series called Canyon Kitties that depicted short, chubby Native American children doing cute things. At any rate, so the painting, Vegetable House, is Swinnerton's recollection or his depiction of a scene out at or near the property of William Randolph Hearst near Grandview Point. And if you're interested in looking for that location, it's a little bit to the south and east of Grandview Point. And that's all I can tell you. All right, let's move on. I'm going to take this and put it over here. Next up, so we have a lot of variety here today, which is great. Next up is a multicolored woodblock print made by the Japanese artist Hiroshi Yoshida. Hiroshi Yoshida was from Japan. He returned to Japan after traveling the world on a couple of trips. And he was a leading master of the popular Shinhanga style of printmaking.
I'm getting a lot of glare. Lay it down.
Okay. Or how about this, a little bit of an angle?
Yeah. There's a lot of glare from the windows.
Yeah.
On the glass.
Okay. Hope you all can see that okay. And you can see, if you've ever done relief printing, you can see that this is a real masterpiece of woodblock printing. I don't know how many colors this is, but it certainly looks like at least 5 or 6 or 7. In 1904, Yoshida took off he came to the United States where he took part in an exhibition in Detroit. And from there he went to Europe and he traveled around drawing and painting famous landscape scenes in the Alps and Italy and France and Germany. And he returned to the United States, and here he traveled around to a variety of national parks, again, drawing and painting, kind of the iconic landscape scenes of our national parks, among them Rocky Mountain National Park and Mount Rainier and Grand Canyon. And so he would have done probably fairly detailed drawings and maybe plein air oil paintings or watercolor paintings. And he would have done this print when he returned to his studio in Japan. And he was such a popular artist that he hired a number of master printmakers who worked with him. And so he really oversaw a studio, kind of a production studio there. And there are a couple of different versions of it. We actually have another version of this print in our collection, but I picked this one because it's the most colorful.
What's the name of the artist again?
Hiroshi Yoshida. Okay. Beautiful, beautiful print. I've only ever been able to manage a fairly sad single color linoleum block printing. Okay, let's see. The next up, and we're not going in chronological order here necessarily. This cart just happened to be a pretty good prop for the paintings. Next up is a painting by Flagstaff artist Bruce Aiken. And I picked this painting because it's not the Grand Canyon. Why, you might ask? This is the view of the Aubrey Cliffs north of Seligman, Arizona. Excuse me. And the reason why I picked it is because Bruce is very well known for his paintings of Grand Canyon. Bruce and his wife Mary lived inside the canyon at Roaring Springs for 30 years, where they raised their three children. And of course, Bruce is well known for his paintings of the inner canyon and views from the rims. But the reason I like this painting, and the reason why I wanted to show it, is because, first of all, it's a pretty killer painting. And when I see these clouds, I just always really love them. But I picked it because for those of you who live here around the Grand Canyon, wherever that might be, for me, I love being around the canyon as much as I love being on the rim or in the canyon. Because I feel like when I'm anywhere where there are aspects of the geological structure and nature of the canyon, like the Aubrey Cliffs, I feel like I'm kind of on the fringe or the outskirts of the canyon, and know, from experience, that it's kind of just over the hill there. And I still feel the power and the connection with it in that proximity. And in the case of the Aubrey Cliffs, if you travel along the Aubrey Cliffs to the north, you eventually wind up in Prospect Canyon. Prospect Canyon is a major side canyon and tributary of the Colorado River on what's now the Wallapai Reservation. And if you've been on a Grand Canyon River trip, you know that Prospect Canyon is where Lava Falls Rapids is. So by extension, if you imagine following the Aubrey Cliffs to the north, you can kind of in your mind connect with Prospect Canyon and Lava Falls. But the color in this is just beautiful, which is why I like to show it. We've exhibited this in a couple of exhibitions over the years here at MNA, and you can see that the color it's really rich. I mean, if this was an ice cream sundae, I'd want to gobble this up. And I really appreciate Bruce thinking about this kind of subject because, for most Grand Canyon artists, the canyon itself is the prime subject, as maybe it should be. But again, for those of us who have intimate experience with the canyon, just a related landscape like this valley and the Aubrey Cliffs can connect us with the canyon. And again, you can see, going back to Clarence Dutton and his advice that people from the East aren't necessarily going to appreciate a landscape like this. I think this is a pretty good example because to an Easterner, and that meaning is also predicated on land use. And, for a farmer looking at a scene like this, a farmer would look at this and his first thought would probably be, he's hoping that there's going to be an easy drilling for a well here or some substantial water supply. Much of the appreciation of land in the United States in the 19th century and even to this day has to do with the usefulness of that land, for better or worse. And so much of the response, going back to Holmes's print, most of the response to a landscape like that would have been one of, not just aesthetic dismay, but, basically writing it off. And, of what value is this? It's of no practical value. And in fact, in his 1858 expedition, Lieutenant Joseph Christmas Ives, to paraphrase, basically wrote that the land is altogether useless, and upon arriving here, meaning the Grand Canyon, the only thing to do is to leave. And and there's the famous continuation of that quote where he says that theirs is doubtless the last party of whites to visit this profitless locale. So we view wilderness and land like this very differently today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move this one. So are we leaving time for questions?
Up to you.
Okay.
I haven't seen any questions yet except for that question about repeating the name. So.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so if you have questions, please contact us.
Just type them in.
Okay, and actually I'm going to change the props here a little bit.
Just letting people see this one in between.
Okay. All right, I'm going to pull this over here. And I'm going to replace it. I'm going to replace it with something very different. So many of you may know that I'm working on a book and a catalog of paintings by Gunnar Woodforce. Gunnar Woodforce was a Swedish painter who came to the United States in 1920. And he originally landed in California. He took a steamship to New York City, took the train across the country, landed in Los Angeles, and began working around Los Angeles, including he spent a month out on Catalina Island in Avalon painting, where he met William Wrigley Jr., the chewing gum millionaire, and sold a few paintings to Mr. Wrigley. And he continued up the coast to Carmel, again, where there was an artist community, which he would have known about just, through word of mouth, if nothing else, and spent a little time in Carmel and Monterey. And by March that year, he had made his way to Yosemite. And he made Yosemite his home, basically his permanent home for the next couple of years. And then in March of 1923, he met Stephen Mather, first director of the National Park Service. And Mather suggested that he focus his creative energy on the national parks. And this is a really important story about our national parks that's largely unsung at this point. When Mather met Woodforce, initially neither knew who the other was. It was kind of a chance meeting. But at some point, after they had introduced each other themselves, the little light bulb over Mather's head would have gone off, and thinking to himself, aha, this is the artist I need to give vision to our national parks. Because remember, the National Park Service was only 7 years old at that point, and they were still working on defining themselves as the Park Service, but they're also working on how do we market the national parks. And of course, Mather was a marketing genius, and he really knew how to get people out, and he was ultimately very successful at it. But he saw Woodforce as the artist who had the aesthetic and technical ability to convey the essence of the beauty of our national parks. So Mather initially, and Gunnar, upon learning that this was Stephen Mather he was listening to, the light bulb over his head would have gone off, and it would have included dollar signs because he saw some potential for work there, which in fact there turned out to be. Mather commissioned Woodforce to visit Zion National Park, and in March Gunnar drove over there, returned to Yosemite, but in June returned to Zion to do more painting, and in July made his first visit to the North Rim and South Rim of the Grand Canyon and met the subject that he's best known for. So when Gunnar arrived in the United States, he was in his 40s, and he had met some success in Europe, and his paintings were found in some notable collections. And most importantly, he had developed his technical ability to a very high degree. And he was always up for a challenge. He sought beautiful landscapes to paint, but he also sought challenges. And so when he first got to Yosemite, I have to imagine that he was first taken aback by the stunning space and beauty of Yosemite Valley, but also he would have recognized a great challenge. And he had the technical ability to address that challenge. And it's kind of like getting to Yosemite kicked him up a whole nother level in terms of his technical ability and just his kind of general artistic aesthetic. And I think that he had the same experience when he came to the Grand Canyon. I think that Yosemite kind of prepared him for the Grand Canyon. And the interesting thing, I don't have a photograph to show you, but the interesting thing about when he got to the Grand Canyon in July of 1923 is he didn't start painting a little side canyon or one of the points jutting out from the North Rim. He did the whole enchilada, I like to say. He did the big panoramic view from where the North Rim Lodge is today. That includes Deva and Brahma and Zoroaster temples all lined up there, very architectural, and a really substantial and challenging subject for any artist. So he jumped in the deep end from 30 feet up right off the bat. Now I'm showing this painting, I'm going to show you two. I'm showing you this painting for two reasons. First of all, it's a recent gift, and thank you Martha Trissler for this beautiful painting. By family, Martha is related to the Verkamp family. And this painting was originally given by Mary Jane Coulter to one of the extended Verkamp family members who was working for her on the South Rim. And the other reason why so it's got a great story, a great provenance. And the other reason I'm showing this is because it's really atypical for Gunnar. Usually his paintings are pretty brightly colored. They're really usually exuding light. But this is a dark view of the inner canyon. This is the mouth of Bright Angel Creek down from Phantom Ranch, and the Colorado River would be right down here. And so if you've walked up to Phantom Ranch from the Colorado River, you've walked along this pathway. And it kind of looks like those scenes of the Wicked Witch's castle, in The Wizard of Oz. I kind of think about that when I see this painting. But look at these really beautifully lit areas up on the Vishnu schist that captures what must be late afternoon light coming in from the west. There's no rim, there's not even any tapete sandstone here, the next layer on top of the Vishnu schist. It's entirely Vishnu schist, and he conveys the darkness of it, he conveys kind of the moodiness of it when it's not directly lit like you can see down in here. And it's also a very rare inner canyon painting for this time period. Gunnar was, for a fellow who had some health problems and who smoked sometimes 2 packs of cigarettes a day, he was extremely adventurous. And if you look at pictures of him, you might not ever guess that. But he did a number of really adventurous hikes into the inner canyon. And aside from Louis Aiken, up until probably, without doing some research, I want to say up until Merrill Mahaffey began doing river paintings in the 1970s and 80s, Gunnar and Louis Aiken are a rare group of artists, I'll put it that way, who were doing inner canyon paintings. Gunnar would often spend weeks at a stretch at Phantom Ranch, usually in the winter time. One winter he spent 6 weeks down there. And he did a number of paintings of Bright Angel Canyon. And in fact, there's a painting very similar to this one, which is, in terms of light and color, the exact opposite of this painting. It's painted in midday light. The colors are brilliant. But I love the darkness of this one because it's so atypical for him. Interesting side note, Gunnar liked to drink also. And the manager of Phantom Ranch at that time, a fellow named Tom Moore, was known as a moonshiner. So Gunnar, the chances of getting busted making moonshine at Phantom Ranch were probably fairly slim. So I just love this painting, and I'm so grateful to the Tristlers for their gift. We acquired this a year ago. I'm going to go get another one here. And this is a little bit more typical of Gunnar's Grand Canyon paintings. This is a view from Hopi Point. This is Powell Memorial Point over here. Here's the battleship. Here's Newton Butte heading east, and then on the eastern skyline, Vishnu Temple and Wotan's throne. This is a location where I take my drawing workshops pretty regularly because it's a great open area, and the views, you have a lot of choices of what you can do from here. And Gunnar did many, many, many paintings from Hopi Point or very nearby. So you can see, looking at this painting, that his more typical color is very brilliant. It's not really intense, but it's very clear and brilliant. And one of his greatest abilities, and what makes him such a successful Grand Canyon painter, and really every current Grand Canyon painter who I've talked to, many of whom are close friends, hold Gunnar in the highest esteem. And that's because when you look back through the landscape of Grand Canyon, he has a very clearly defined foreground. And as you move back in space, you can see how the colors gradually become less intense and ultimately bluer and more neutral as we get back towards the distant horizon. So he's got impeccable control of light and shade and how that affects color as you move back in a deep space like this. So after about 1926, Gunnar was calling Grand Canyon his home, and certainly by 1928, that's where he spent most of his time. He would still go back to California. He would go back to California to paint, and he exhibited regularly with the California Watercolor Society, and he had regular exhibitions in San Francisco and Los Angeles. But he always returned to the South Rim by that time because he had very close friends there, both in the Park Service and people who worked for the various concessions. but he felt very at home in this little community. And when the Great Depression began in 1929, 1930, of course, tourism dropped off pretty dramatically. There were still tourists, and he still managed to make a living, but he reduced his prices by almost half. And his friends, as you might guess by looking at this painting, he was a real type A, very focused, very meticulous person. And friends of his said that he would do a very detailed pencil drawing before he began a painting like this. But at any rate, his friends, realized that he wasn't going to be selling large paintings like this for $500 during the Depression. So he reduced his prices to as low as $125 for a painting like this. And for comparison, to kind of give you a sense of what that's like today, in 1934 he bought a new car, and he paid $500 for it. It was a Ford Tudor. And before the Depression, he was selling paintings like this for $500, to put that in perspective. So what I was going to say is, his friend said, Gunnar, stop doing these big, intricate paintings. Do some smaller things that are a little bit simpler that you can knock out in a day or two. In 1907, he wrote to his mother from the French Riviera, did 7 paintings this afternoon. He wasn't talking about paintings like this. He was talking about postcards that he could basically sell over his shoulder when people stopped, to look at his work. He said that a painting like this would take him 10 or 12 days because he worked entirely outdoors, and because when you're working outdoors as an artist, the movement of the sun through the sky throughout the day changes the lighting pretty rapidly. And so he would really only be able to work on this for an hour or 2 at the most on any given day. So he would work on this over a period of 10 or 12 days. And based on that, I could create a sense of his lifetime output. And I estimate that throughout his lifetime, because I know when he was traveling and when he wasn't traveling and that sort of thing. And I estimate that throughout his lifetime, he painted about 4,500 paintings that include large ones like this, but also include smaller ones and little 5x7 postcards. I think it's interesting too, if you can come up closer, Chris, and zoom in, you can see the border line that he drew around the painting to define his space. And you can also see he used thumbtacks, which I think would be really awkward. But he used thumbtacks to hold his paper onto on his board. And one of the endearing things about getting to know Gunnar so well over the last 11 years is that when you look at photographs of him, he had the same easel throughout his whole career. And it's kind of sweet to see this easel in all these various locations that he worked in. So I'm going to wrap it up here with Gunnar, who is, I believe, and like I said, a lot of my peers believe, is the Grand Canyon painter par excellence. And it's worth noting that the Museum of Northern Arizona has the largest museum collection of his works. We have 23 paintings and drawings. And Gunnar established a relationship with the museum in the late 1920s when Mary Russell Farrell Colton initiated her annual summer exhibition called the Arizona Artists and Craftsmen Exhibition. They brought work from artists all over the state of Arizona. And Gunnar participated in those exhibitions and was often awarded prizes for his work. And of course, that would have been a short jaunt for him down from the South Rim. So if you have questions, please send them in, and I will do my best to try and answer them. And thank you very much for joining us.
I'm just looking to see, I don't see any. We've got some thank yous, but no questions right now. So.
Okay, well, if you'd like to, if a question comes to mind later, you can certainly find me on Facebook or my email on the museum's website. And feel free to contact me. And I forgot to mention, which I should mention, is that the catalog raisonné that I've been compiling of Gunner's work for the last 11 years now will be published online within the next month. So look forward to some news about that.